circumstances. I mean, I feel that the care of an electoral register should not be within the remit, and because it has placed an undue burden on staff who are not properly trained for compiling a register of electors. And it's something that, you know, even speaking to local authority members who work in the area of compiling the register, they feel the same, and have those people being spoken to, because I mean, it's clerks, maybe junior clerks, that are brought in from time to time to help with the register, that wouldn't have a great deal of experience in that area or working in that area. I mean, it's the politician that always gets the anger in around on polling day, and for a few days afterwards, if they find that their names aren't in a register, and I mean, it can cause a great deal of confusion at a polling station as well if there are inaccuracies on the register on the day, and people are advised to check the register well in advance, but very few do. Just on the issue of, in Northern Ireland, they have, I think, they have an electoral commission, and it was established nearly 40 years ago now, and it is working very, very satisfactory. I know there is an obligation on people to vote, but I think that young people and not so young have to. It's compulsory for them to register to vote there, and I think that's a very good system that is in operation up there. Also, you know, I mean, they'd tell you that the electoral register in Northern Ireland doesn't have the same problems as we have here in the south. I mean, I met a person recently who told me that they were on 6 registers. And I mean, they could have, you know, I know it would be illegal, but there was a possibility that a person in that sort of a circumstance could have voted 6 times if they wished. I know they would be breaking the law, and they knew it themselves. But I mean, you know, that shouldn't be the case. A person should be on the register and registered to vote only once at one particular location. And I mean, that's an error, and it crops up all the time. And there are thousands of people out there whose names are duplicated on the register. And we haven't a correct register or an accurate register until we eliminate those type of errors too. You know, I mean, the existing administration of the electoral system has been piecemeal, and it has been lacking a cohesive approach. And this, from talking to people, you'd be told that. And I for a long time, have felt that an independent body, free from government or political interference, would be more acceptable to everybody and to all political parties as well. Also, a CEO who should be who should not be a member of the civil service should maybe with the same powers as they have a judge or a district court or a high court judge should be an electoral commissioner or an electoral commissioner, and there should be special terms of reference issued to that particular person. And I feel that we need to put a system in place as a model.
There's 4 minutes left. Do you want to ask a couple of questions and give this as an opportunity to answer?
Practice. Just a couple of questions. I move on to the questions now. Just in relation to all other countries across Europe, does any system operate similar to ourselves, or are we unique in Europe in that we are the only country that has this role or that has this register that has to be compiled on an annual basis? Are there I think most other European countries have a role in register, and maybe you give us an indication as what happens in the rest of Europe, and where we give model a practice on, in what country or what state we give model a practice on for Ireland going forward.
Would you direct that question to which for?
Well.
Bear in mind, now we have 3 minutes left.
I'm sure I need whichever
okay.
panel.
Does anybody want to take that question in particular?
I couldn't speak to every country in Europe, but I remember asking a professor of politics from Amsterdam University what they do about the electoral register in the Netherlands, and he said, "Well, you know, we know where everybody lives. As soon as you move into a house, you are required, you know, to register yourself." Now, most of Europe operates under a law that's more Napoleonic than British, and the role of the citizen is probably more subject than it typically was under British law. But in terms of an electoral register, they're far more effective than ours. Ours are probably a bit more like the US, which is probably the worst electoral register in the world, where anything up to about 30% of the electorate are not on the electoral register at all. So by US standards, we're doing pretty well, but by the standards of most of the rest of the democratic world, we're doing poorly.
And just another question in relation to the new air codes that legislation was passed last week on. Do you think that it will improve the accuracy of the electoral register? And also in relation to extending the remit of the Electoral Commission to maintaining the register of political parties, should this be the case?
I certainly think an electoral commission should take overall responsibility for an electoral register. The advantage of the new air codes, about which I know very little, is at least they have a unique address. Everybody in my road has the same address, so it's not very unique. And certainly having a unique address might make it marginally more easy to locate a precise individual at a precise address. But I think it's the will at the centre that's the most important thing. And if you have an agency that's dedicated to providing us with a really good electoral register, then we're more likely to have one. Then we might see an end, for better or worse, of people flying back from Australia to vote because they won't be on the electoral register anymore because they don't live here.
Thank you.
Stanley.
Thanks, I want to welcome the panel and their contribution on this discussion. I think that the need for a body to deal with much of the roles that we've set out is just fairly broad support for that. And I think that the diagram that you produced is useful in terms of showing at least some examples in other countries of what an electoral commission would look like and what roles would have. The difficulty I see is that that we're in anti-Quango mode, that people will say, here's another super Quango, and of course the questions over what roles it will have. Will it take on the role of the Boundary Commission? Will it take on SIPO? Will it take on some of the roles currently carried out by the local authorities and the franchise section of the Department of Environment and Community Local Government? You might some of the panel might just address that. I think that the question over whether it should be an oversight, and you can see from your contribution here today that there's divergent views on this, whether it's an oversight body or whether it's oversight and operational. In other words, it does the full thing. That's obviously a question that's there. And I mean, I think that there's, given the electoral system that we have, registration system that we have, I'm not too sure how we can cut out local authorities. And I think some people working in local authorities would take exception to some of the criticism that, and there's nothing wrong with people taking exception to criticism, but in relation to their level of expertise, that's not the issue. Local authorities should be well capable of getting people. It's not a very complicated thing to register people how to vote and to make sure they're not having to register twice. The issue is the system that we have for registration. That's the question, and that's the single biggest issue. I know I've been banging this drum for a long time, and I'm very much in favour of trying to weed out situations. I'm particularly concerned about the deputies over there on the government benches when they talk about meeting people that are on the register up to 6 times. I'm very concerned about that. That needs to be, that highlights the need for that issue to be dealt with. And 28 people at one address in County Monaghan after the last election, I think it was at Gaeltacht House, that would, just that examples like that, I think, highlight the urgency of dealing with this with registration process and trying to ensure that people are registered once and once only. Deputy Bannon is correct. There was some improvements made in the North, and another party I belong to insisted very strongly on doing that, and I think in a subsequent election we improved our performance by about 30%, 25 or 30%. So it worked well for us having a good register and ensuring that parties don't, or independents don't, fix the register. So I think that's. So I'd like to hear some examples of how maybe we might address that, because I think that is the single biggest issue, and how that's addressed will, in large measure, determine the operational remit of this body. If we're still going to tie it to an address, then the local authority will have to continue having a major role, because wherever the local authority will have some hope of finding out who lives where. And the difficulty with the system is, I mean, the system that's there would have worked quite well, when we had rates collectors who performed that role of the rates collectors, but there were also intelligence gatherers in terms of the electoral register, rent collectors, when there was more local councillors. No, and this is something that has happened, and I'm not making a judgment. I will have my own opinion about it, but in relation to, we now have 950 councillors. We don't have roughly 1,450 councillors, because some of them are dual roles. So on paper there was over 1,600 seats, but in terms of personnel, it used to be about 1,450 town and county councillors, and that's another bunch of people who would have been, particularly town councillors, were very good at gathering that kind of information, and that's gone. But just specifically in relation to the Commission, which I think it has merit and certainly would support it, what roles you give it, as I say, the registration one, I think the jury should be out on that until we decide how we're going to actually make this register 100% accurate. I think that who would appoint the members of the Commission? Who appoints the members of the Boundary Commission at the moment? I would be interested to know, how to get appointed, how to come to the conclusions that they come to, how to decide to saw counties in half and cut out chunks of South Tipper or North Tipperary and lump them in with Offaly, and bite off little bits of South Kildare and lump them in with County Laois. I think that the suggestion that it would be accountable to the Oireachtas is a very good one, rather than to a minister of the day. But I think who appoints that body, I think, is key. How those members are appointed, and I'd like to hear some views on that. Just in relation to, as well, maybe the panel's view on funding, the vexed question of funding for political parties, and just on the gender balance. I'm a bit curious about this, about how a Quine Gora body, thanks Gaeltacht, would fix that, because I've spoken to some people inside this House, people who are elected to the Dáil in particular, but also to people who are elected to local authorities, first-timers, they're just past their first year now, and women and men, but particularly women, tell me that it's not a problem getting the nomination. In fact, it's easy to get the nomination. It's easy enough to get going, and it's easy enough, and women, as shown, like that when women put themselves forward, they can get elected. The problem is when they get elected, and this goes for men as well, that it's got to do with the hours. The place just down the corridor here, that's it sometimes. There's one morning we went out of here, I think it's 7:15 when I got home. That was 6:45 a.m. So I'm not too sure how that, I think that's the issue, one of the issues. And also the fact that, thanks Gaeltacht, just keep taking them off there, that the role of the role that members of local authorities and TDs are expected to perform. I think that's the issue, and the hours in particular that the Dáil said, I think that's an issue. Just the issue of the local government, I think that you put forward here today that would have a role in terms of the election counts and that would happen. But I think that, while we have an address-based system, I can't see how the local authorities can be taken out of the equation too easily. And just the last question I'd raise, Gaeltacht, is in relation to the PPS numbers. I have suggested in the past, now I know I raised this with former Minister Phil Hogan many times, about the need for maybe to tie it to the PPS number, but he put forward a very valid point. He said that there was more, we had a lot more PPS numbers than we actually had people living in these 3 quarters of the island of Ireland. In fact, we had as much PPS numbers as we had people living on the whole island of Ireland, despite the fact that the border cuts off 6 counties, which would indicate maybe that there's a lot of people have emigrated and a lot of immigrants have returned, and people who have died still have PPS numbers. So I'm just wondering, is it the panel's view that we could tie the registration of voters to the PPS number, or is there a system that we could use to do that? Thanks, Gaeltacht.
Professor Fowler.
A few seconds to give responses here, so if I could just very quickly, there's some very interesting detail in Deputy Stanley's questions, but they all come to the same thing to a large degree, which is trying to look at details. And one of the reasons that Deputy Cowan was able to talk about how this government hasn't, met the need to introduce the Electoral Commission, like his government didn't either, is because a lot of focus is on detail.
Thank you,
You're putting the cart before the horse here. What is needed urgently, as we say in our paper, is the establishment of the Electoral Commission. When it is established, it should be given a remit which would include things like the sort of questions you're talking about. But if you keep on talking about the details of electoral registers and PPS numbers, this is never going to happen.
Could I make 2 points? Yeah, I can certainly attest to both of you having moved across the border. I was never asked for ID until I went to vote in Belfast, and I was certainly asked for ID then. But I was, and again, it's quite difficult to get on the register there, and you have to prove a lot of things. And I've moved once since, and I had to come off one and on the other, so it's a very different experience, a much more regulated system. But I think the points you've made are very, very important here, just about what exactly is the role. And I might differ a little bit with you here, David, about saying, look, maybe you're not saying this, but we need an electoral commission, and once it's set up, then we'll decide what it's going to do. Whereas I think there's been a problem in the Irish administrative system, is perhaps the rush, and that's why this discussion is very useful. But is the role of this commission just to iron out kinks in the system, as you've pointed out, the register? Maybe you only need to set it up for 5 years, and when they're finished, the electoral commission is no longer needed. Now, that probably won't happen. But the bigger question, and this is the challenge for me, or I would say this is, if it's agreed we need an electoral commission immediately to sort out some very glaring problems in the Irish system, that's fine. But thereafter, what does it do? And how do you know it's doing a good job? Like every public organisation in Ireland should be pushed at all times to improve the quality and performance, in this case, of the Irish democratic process and so on. So I was very interested in the list in the 2008 document saying, well, what about codes of conduct for returning officers? What else can this commission do? So thinking beyond day one, I think this is very, very important, so that we don't just set up a commission that solves a problem and then it's sitting there and nobody quite knows what to do with it. So really thinking an ambitious agenda way into the future.
Dr. Reedy.
There's a lot of international practice in terms of how commissions are appointed. Just to go back to the Canadian example, here the government consult with the other political parties in Parliament. A person is agreed upon, they appear before a parliamentary committee, and then it's a vote of Parliament that formally appoints them. In a lot of other countries, some of the examples that Professor Marsh gave, you have 3-person or 10-person commissions, and again similar types of procedures. So there's quite a lot of scrutiny in advance. I suppose to some extent there's nothing saying that a government couldn't insist on a partisan appointment, but in a substantial democracy they're very unlikely to get away with that, and all of the procedures involve consultation. Just to follow up on your other question there in relation to scale, I suppose that going to the New Zealand example, their annual budget is 6 million New Zealand dollars. They have a staff of about permanent staff of 30, which expands in advance of the election when polling and tabulation staff are recruited. On the other end of the spectrum, you do have the Canadian example. It has a permanent staff of about 500. Last year, I think it was, their annual budget was 87 million Canadian dollars, and they spend about 100 million Canadian dollars in each election. But that's an enormous country. Population is I suppose not as big, but it is a federal structure, so it's quite complicated. So I think probably the Irish case would be perhaps more to the New Zealand inner end of the spectrum. And just the last thing is in relation to gender balance. The point we're making is that the government, and I think all parties have agreed to this, is that there should be 40% gender balance on all state boards, and that principle should be adhered to as well in terms of the composition of the commission. In terms of the gender legislation, the quotas that have been introduced. In due course, of course, the Electoral Commission would be responsible for administering those, and there are certainly quite a lot of other areas where the Electoral Commission could make contributions in terms of improving gender balance. But it's important to say that the Commission itself, can't transform anything. It can work with other strategies in that particular area.
Deputy Maloney.
Thanks, Chair. Thank the speakers for the contributions. I was just on the question of that Deputy Stanley was raising earlier. It just reminded me that in the locality that I was born, there was a very strong political tradition, which as a child I took very seriously, and that was that you voted early and voted very often. I'm not suggesting for 1 second that, given that this is recorded, that I ever exercised that, because I got away out of there as quickly as possible. But nevertheless, just whatever about the merits of an electoral commission in today's world, or today's Ireland, certainly there was a big need for one back then, but Shin scale Ella. I'm not entirely convinced about the merits of an electoral commission. The 2008 report is a very interesting report, but I think that sometimes, for example, and one of you just touched on, there's this question of population size. I think is a big factor in this. I'm not saying it's the only one. But it's what I mean. I think sometimes we get carried away, particularly in this House, about our importance in the world. That we're some sort of superpower, and that I think maybe this is one of the examples. I mean, there's a very small population, a very small number of people go out to vote. However, that's no reason for having it done in an orderly way, an accountable way. I'm not taken away from that, but so. I don't get terribly excited about it, and I won't be putting it on my literature next April. But the two things, I thought that I think one of the great shortcomings, and certainly in terms of recent referendums, and I was waiting for one of the five of you, maybe you said it when I was out of the room, I was waiting for one of the five of you to refer to what happened during the referendum on the Shannon, and the appalling way that the ballot paper was dealt with. And I've said it in this House on another topic, on another debate, that because I witnessed this myself, and I'm sure other deputies did as well on that particular day, that the wording in the ballot paper, I saw people, as I know other people, members of this House did, filling up one ballot paper, the one that related to the, I think it was the children's rights, was it? Or have I got inquiries? Sorry, the inquiries, I beg your pardon. And the other, and people looked at the specific colour that Court of Appeal. You're right, actually, yes. Sorry for that. Even TDs have shortcomings. But I saw people putting back the Shannon paper, and I doubt, well, maybe everyone here may not agree with me, but actually in the polling booth you could see people folding it, just putting it back. They didn't vote on it because the wording, etc., was so a thing. But I thought that, given the subject matter, that somebody would have mentioned that. And secondly, as I've said before, if the referendum commission had made bags of it for that particular referendum, if that had happened during the Scottish referendum last year, there would have been another referendum. All hell would have broken loose. But there wasn't. It's one of the extraordinary things that so many people wrapped up their paper because they couldn't, the confusion. Now, I'm not saying it was by design or otherwise, but, and I have my own opinion about the Shannon, but we won't go down that road today. It'll irritate more people. As regards to one of the, and quite rightly, one of the merits you argue in terms of the Electoral Commission was the registration of the electors. Like my colleague here, I think local authorities do the very best job they can possibly do. And obviously I'm very pro local government. Very lucky to have good councils, particularly in Dublin. But I think the staff do the best they can do. The difference is that, and I think Professor Marsh, you used the word civic earlier on, and that's one of the problems that we have. It's not a problem, it's just a reality. Being an island off other islands, that we don't have the sort of civic responsibility that other Europeans have, where, the Romans didn't come here and we have a strong Luddite tradition, etc. People don't go out to great, if they're not in the register of electors, some people take it very seriously. Other people, if they go up to the polling booth and they're not registered, it's not the end of the world. They go home and watch EastEnders, you know. And so I think we have to get to a place where, and education is part of that, where people take the thing about the franchise seriously, very seriously. And that's something we have to overcome. And lastly, Chairman, just very two things. One, the other thing, nobody referred to the new difficulty that all politicians, and I refer to all politicians in this House, have now. The greatest problem that we have in relation to elections and referendums is the number of people going out to vote doesn't decline. People talk about the turnout. I don't talk about the turnout anymore, because in the two recent I'm not so sure about Carlow Kilkenny, but certainly in the by-election in my constituency, Dublin South West, and the recent referendums, the issue wasn't the turnout, it was the number of people who stayed at home. And that's the problem we have. People are not going out to vote. And there are those who argue that next April it's going to be repeated again. Now we're up, I mean, I take my share of responsibility for that, but that's what's happened. And finally, Chair, the thing about setting up a commission, a new commission, and there's an accelerating hostility amongst most of the public towards another body, or to use the language I like to use, another quango, etc., appointed by a government. In fact, whether it's this government or some other government, I've said this before, we are going to run out of retired judges. And we will have to import them because we have so many commissions going on and inquiries. We're going to have to bring them into the country. But I mean, that's where we are. And the other thing is, I'm always amazed about this thing about the independence of judges. Now, I don't know any judges. There's none living in my estate, so I don't have any. I don't mix with them. But this notion that judges, Irish judges, are independent, etc. Judges in this country are the most political and ideology. Yeah, well, I know what side of the House they vote, but. They start, to suggest that we can bring in somebody who's going to be entirely impartial, etc. I think I'd be more inclined to bring in a retired judge from Greece to carry out this than put in one of our own. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Deputy. Does anyone want to, Professor Marsh?
A couple of points there. On the wording of the question, I think it's very important that when referendums are given to the people that the question is clear. And in my submission, I pointed to the role of the UK Electoral Commission in starting research now for the referendum they'll have on the European Union. It's already undertaking all sorts of research on the different ways in which that might be worded, and they can then advise the government. It's one of those things that an electoral commission can do in a neutral way. They also talk about whether the vote should be held on the same day as any other elections. And David Cameron announced the other day that he saw no problem. They did it with the alternative vote referendum last year or the year before. He was pleased with the result of that. The fact that the public were thoroughly confused by it is beside the point. And I think we know that when we have referendums on the same day as other elections, sometimes people can get a little confused. We had a wonderful referendum on the power of the Oireachtas to conduct inquiries, and the evidence was that never in their lives had citizens been more confused about any referendum they were about that one. Most of them didn't know there was a referendum because there was a presidential election on the same day. So I think electoral commissions can help with that. Just in terms of, I suppose, the expansion of government, I'm not particularly keen on seeing ever more civil servants. Since they'll be looking for pensions and I'm looking for my pension, I don't really want the money to go to somebody else. But I think the whole point about the Electoral Commission is that the government or ad hoc bodies are already doing all these things one way or another. You don't necessarily need any more people. Arguably, you'd only need one judge, not 3 judges in future. It's a matter of combining functions so that they can be better done rather than anything else.
If I could just reinforce the final point, because it's come up twice about creating more quangos. I think all of us around the table, and we're not alone in saying this, have been repeatedly saying if you introduce an electoral commission, you reduce the number of quangos. The Boundary Commission, the Party Register, the Referendum Commission, SIPO, they will all be replaced by one body, one judge, not several judges. So we'd actually be making government more efficient.
Very good point. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Rowan. That was Deputy Maloney. Now back to opposition and Senator McAneil.
Sorry, Carol, can I just ask? I thought I was here before.
No, Senator McAneil was at the beginning.
Oh, sorry about that. No, it's just I have to leave for something.
Okay.
Sorry, I have to apologise because I did leave because of the rules. I had to go and speak to Shannon, so I'll be very brief. And some of these issues might have been raised before, so again, I apologise if I'm repeating myself. What I will say is that I'm in favour of an independent electoral commission. We brought this up at the Shannon many times, including we voted on it, and so I do think it's an absolute disgrace that this government has, in its 5 years, failed to deliver on the cornerstone of political and electoral reform. And really, it's beyond words in terms of, I mean, I would back up what Dr. Reedy said about it being regrettable, the fact that it's taken 5 years and it won't be delivered for the next general election. And whatever about, fears of quangos, but ultimately it, in my view, undermines potential political participation, good positive political culture, trust, accountability, and I think it really is a slight on both parties, in my view, that they weren't able to deliver this in 5 years. Something with a pre-existing report 2008 alone, if they just went with that alone, never mind additional information. So certainly our group and the Shannon Independent Group, we've called it many times, and I now welcome the fact that the committee is pushing it, but really, what are the likelihood in the next government for it to be instituted for a further election is something that I feel slightly depressed about. My own particular interest is, and in a way, I'm mindful of what Professor Farrell said about kind of detail, but I would like to take the opportunity to hear all qualified political scientists, including, by the way, Professor Marsh, who actually taught me in Trinity, just in case you might think a conflict of interest there. I better just acknowledge that straight away. It is all his fault, yeah, that I'm not even elected, that I'm a nominated senator. So even that is slightly bizarre in terms of democracy, even though the referendum to retain the Shannon, I take as an endorsement of that. But anyway, just on registration, I mean, I'm interested in your views and possibly the practice that you've seen worldwide regarding easier, more transparent voter registration and how that can link up to increased participation. Indeed, linking with Deputy Maloney's of the turnout, who's staying at home, who's not staying home. We saw very recently a surge in the late registration vote, but even that, we can do digital banking, we can do all kinds of, God forbid, we can even pay our water charges online. What is it? Have you seen a model of both voter registration, but also? I note, because I was a witness at local elections and federal elections in the state of North Carolina, where you could register up to the morning of the election, all right? And therefore, in other words, as opposed to putting obstacles, I mean, I had this ridiculous scenario in trying to convince former Minister Hogan that the postal vote, like the most obtuse, that I tried to get to narrow the time lag between applying for a postal vote and voting. In other words, it seems to me the philosophy in this country is to make it more difficult for all of us to vote. And I'd like to hear, just on a kind of a practical level, if you can give us examples of where you think both voter registration has worked. I noticed in Professor Marsh's slide that the UK is the only one who doesn't do managing the electoral register, but I mean, it's around public education, it's around participation, it's around increased trust, and then finally, the final question is your own view on lowering the age of voting. Tying all that up into, I'd like to hear you using that.
Okay, Professor Marsh.
I should say I'm not an expert in how people register in most countries of the world. It's not something I've done direct research on. What I know about it, I've come across in passing, or as I said earlier, I spoke to a professor in Amsterdam and asked him how it worked. There are some countries I do know about. I know about the US, which I said is one of the worst systems. And the problem in many parts of the US is that many people don't get on the electoral register. So they've tried all, in some states, that suits the state. They don't want poor, uneducated people on the register because they might vote for the wrong people. Same reason we're not necessarily keen on 16-year-olds getting the vote, because they might vote for the wrong people. and so that's the situation. But they've tried some things. When you register for your driving license, and everyone in the US seems to have a driving license, in some states you register to vote at the same time. It's called the motor voter registration. But I think whatever system we have, we don't want a system that puts the responsibility for registering on the individual. I think the responsibility for making sure people are registered is on the state. We think as a state it's important that people have a right to vote. We'll make sure they have a right to vote whether they want it or not. Then we can talk about turnout. At the moment we talk a lot about turnout. Actually we haven't a clue what the turnout is. Not a clue. I mean, it might be 10% more than the figures say. It might be 5% more. The only thing we can be certain about is that more people turn out than the statistics tell us, because we know the electoral register is deficient, and the strong probability is deficient because it's got more names on it than it should have. What age you should vote at is probably outside this particular area, but one of the things I'd expect an electoral commission to do is to generate ideas and research on precisely this sort of issue, in the same way that in Australia, where they actually use exactly the same electoral system that we do in certain circumstances, as they do in New Zealand. It's not so unique as we tend to think it is. The Electoral Commission produces reports about how to improve the operation of the system. Regularly, there's extensive discussion about it in a way that we have never really had since the foundation of the state. That's what an Electoral Commission can do for you.
Dr. Reedy?
I'd add to that, especially in relation to conducting research elections. Canada, the New Zealand Electoral Commission regularly produce research on things like lowering the voting age, and in some countries as well they also do trial runs, so temporarily they reduce the voting age. This has been done in certain regions in Germany. So for some local elections the voting age was reduced to 16, and they evaluated that and they've decided to stick with it. These are exactly the kinds of things that the Electoral Commission should be doing. In terms of increasing participation, I suppose one of the problems that we have a very good, there's quite high levels of trust and integrity in the system, but the system of electoral administration itself is quite moribund. It hasn't really come into the 21st century. So other countries have been experimenting with postal voting. In Latvia they've looked a lot at online voting. We restrict the access to postal voting. We should be looking at how we can actually provide greater access to the polls for citizens. So things like early voting, more postal voting, other ways of casting your ballots. And if you had a structured framework like the Electoral Commission with the capacity to actually do research in the first instance, and then with the agreement of Parliament, as is the case in Canada, conduct trials about how this would run, I think you would be able to expand the electoral functions at the moment, but at the same time as maintaining trust in the system, because you also have to be careful that you shouldn't have a system that kind of quite randomly trials any kind of new innovation. It has to be done within a structured fashion that is accountable to the citizens and grounded in research. In regards to the registration, there are a lot of different options, and Professor Farrell has mentioned already. We really believe that this is something that the Electoral Commission itself should initiate a consultation on in the first instance and then move to it, because it's quite a large job to change the electoral registration process. So once the Electoral Commission is set up, and this is one of the reasons why we believe actually a commission should be set up very quickly, because one of the biggest jobs it will face is in the first instance deciding how electoral registration should occur, and then it needs quite a lead-in time to prepare for the next set of elections, so that you have a robust electoral register in place already, so that you don't have glitches on election day. Oh no, sorry, compulsory voting is in Australia, but I'm not advocating that at all. I mean a registration system that facilitates voters. Some countries do have compulsory registration, but I'm not entirely sure that that's something that there would be any great appetite for.
Professor, would you agree with it?
Me, compulsory? Yeah. I don't like the word compulsory at all when it comes to these types of things, but I certainly think that any structure that's in place should be about facilitating voters and making it as easy as possible for voters to get onto the register, and ensuring that the register itself then is robust thereafter.
Professor Farrell.
I I think that's my colleague was saying. What we'd expect of an electoral commission, of the Irish Electoral Commission, would be that it would be setting standards, it would be monitoring things, it would be experimenting. I lived in Manchester for 20 years, and I can remember voting in a local election in the Asda at the far end of Manchester from where I lived. There were no limitations on my ability to vote because the British Electoral Commission were experimenting, and that's what we would be looking at here. Just to give you one slight potentially mundane example of just how bad things are here. Where do we go when we want to learn who won the election, what the election results were? We go to RTE. We go to a television company. That should be the function of an electoral commission. We shouldn't be using a utility to try and get that information. It should be the job of the Electoral Commission of Ireland to provide that information as it happens, and we don't have that in this country.
Deputy O'Dowd.
Sorry, just reflecting on the point you made there, I'd just like to agree with Dr. Reedy on what she said about encouraging people to vote. And I think, I'm not sure if you referred to there, Professor Farrell, what you said about, about voting in shopping centres, voting where people actually go, having a day for voting, whether we really experimented with a Saturday or a Sunday, which is for many people not a working day. I think if the evidence shows, I think in the early part of the last century, there was a lot more polling stations and a lot more frequently available. But I think if we look at shopping centres specifically, that's where people go. And in their tens of thousands in cities and in their hundreds in smaller towns. I think that without criticising local authorities, and I'm not criticising them, I think today of the rent collector or the rates collector looking after the register is long gone. A change, particularly in an urban environment, is so frequent and so massive that there's no way that you can keep track of them casually or as part of an extra part-time job in addition to your other work. And I think that if there's anybody, I think on post, should be looked at as they know exactly where everybody lives. They deliver the mail, they deliver the bills, they deliver. You know, if we use organisations which are already there, daily visiting homes of people, I think you would have a far better register than you presently have. And if you send out, if you contact people on the register the day after you get it as a public rep, you will find that 10, 15, 20% of those people are incorrectly on the register for some reason or other. And there's a huge margin of error there. So if you get a 70 or 65% turnout at a polling station, that probably it's probably like 80% in real time of the real people who are there who are actually able to vote and alive and there at that time. I think the other issue which is an important issue, is a question of reform. Now, Senator McGonigal referred to it, and I think that he is an example of the reform that this government has actually brought about, because he is here because the Taoiseach properly and rightly nominated him, and indeed the vast majority of Taoiseach's nominees to the Seanad were non-political appointments. And to say that there was no reform flies in the face of his own voice here, because he is his political voice. No, but I just think I'll make that point to you, Senator. And I've no problem listening to criticism, and I welcome it. But I particularly welcome you here, and everybody else, and every voice should be in this Oireachtas. And in the Senate, we did try and reform it. Okay, the people made a choice on that. But the government, I didn't interrupt you, Senator. We put that to the voice of the people. They gave us a result. We took it. The other reform that we had was about the power of Oireachtas committees, which the Oireachtas did put to which the government put to the people. That was turned on. But to say there was no reform is not accurate. The other point I'd like to make is the question of local government reform. I think that one of the big reforms that happened here in our country was the fact that we introduced a very unpopular tax called a property tax, but what that put on a statutory basis an income for local government that would be independent of the tax system, would be based on property values locally. But I think one of the things I'd like to see a commission looking at personally would be the whole question of local government reform. Now, there's been political experiments. I don't think the last one has worked particularly well. And I think that certainly large towns who have lost their corporations or their councils are now at a big disadvantage because they've been subsumed into a county basis, and the local councillors, most people don't know them anymore because they go off to the county town and nobody knows what's happening. There's no local debate on local issues, and I think that's hugely productive. I know it was unproductive in some respects, but it involves the community. Politics is about everybody having a voice, everybody knowing what's going on and making and helping people to participate. And I think that if a commission were to look at or to commission reports on local government reform or on other issues, that they would have the stature, to get the best report. And rather than the government commissioning it, it's the commission who are separate and they have an independent. They have an independent status. So I think there's lots of room for change. I welcome our speakers here today and obviously the professional views which they're sharing with us. But at the end of the day, I think the biggest reform we have to have is obviously in the electoral register. I think everybody has more or less spoken about that. And I think, apart from on POS, maybe the only other people who would do it extremely well would be the revenue commissioners, who also know where we all live. But I think the day of the local authority doing it, I think it's long gone.
Does anyone want to take up those points, if witnesses?
I suppose just to mention in New Zealand, of course, the Electoral Commission has subcontracted it to the New Zealand Postal Service, so there is an international example of that. I think, though, in relation to the Deputy's last point about the structure of local government, it would be seeing the remit of the Electoral Commission as being rather too wide to say that it would be within its functions to review the scale and organisation of local authorities. I think it probably is sensible to try and limit what it does to the electoral process itself. It may be in a broad sense, but not widely enough that it advises the government as to whether town council should be reintroduced or what the ratio. Well, it could have a view, I suppose, about the ratio of numbers of local representatives to population, for example. There might be some incidental issues it could advise on, but the idea that it's some panacea for political reform generally is something to be avoided, I think.
I don't disagree with what you say there on that issue, but maybe to make my point well enough. Local government is hugely expensive. It's hugely important area. And the problem is that I don't believe it's functioning presently adequately or well. And I believe it's falling down in the bigger towns. I'm not talking about the smaller towns of size.
Council, so they've nothing to do.
That's exactly what I was saying, Deputy Cobb. That's exactly what I was
that was a government decision, yeah.
Yeah, I'm entitled to make my point, and I disagree with that decision. And what I'm saying here is that to get the agenda right, and I accept that the Commission shouldn't be looking at tinkering with the system. What I suggest was they maybe should commission or look at what the alternatives are, rather than leave it up to the government of the day to make a decision on that. Or obviously the government at the end of the day has to legislate, or they have to put the proposition. But I think an informed debate, we haven't really had a proper debate on that. And I genuinely, I'm convinced that local government is losing out. Towns are losing out, absolutely and definitively. And that more power has gone to the executive, to the officials, to the administration locally as a result of the reforms, the change that we have made. And that's my honest opinion.
Thank you, Deputy Coppinger.
Just some quick points. I think I'm open to the idea of a commission, but I think people do fear another Quango. How would it relate to the council staff who currently, we don't want to see people losing their jobs, for example. We don't want to see a privatisation, if you like, of looking after the electoral register or other electoral commission functions. I'd also balk at the idea that we automatically have to have a judge in charge of every commission. Why? There are capable and competent people who aren't judges. And in fact, you could argue many judges necessarily aren't automatically competent and capable. I just don't see why it must be, no offence, but a male judge or academic who runs these things. Also, I do think it should be a small staff, but I wanted to raise the kind of people I think that need to be brought into the whole Electoral Commission are the four biggest sectors that are left out of the system currently. The first is migrants. In my own constituency in Dublin West, 23% of people were born outside of Ireland. Most of them are completely disenfranchised. they live here, they work here, they pay taxes here, they have children here, but many of them might be citizens and aren't necessarily haven't transferred to a full vote because they don't even realise, which is something that they're never told. But also many aren't citizens. I personally think they should have a vote after living and working in this country for, say, 5 years. I think it's wrong the way a lot of people felt excluded in recent referendums. The other, I think people like that should be brought in to any discussion. How are these people going to be integrated into the whole political process, because they're currently very excluded from it? The second area that I have huge concerns about is renters. Every time you change your address in this country, you have to go to the Garda station, you have to fill out another form, you have to download a form or get a form from the council. I've borne witness to this from people last year when I was standing in the by-election, and you have to then get the Gardaí, queue up in the station, could be any length of time. Why? The number of renters has increased by 52% in 18 months in this country. 52%, that's according to the Irish Independent Rent Report yesterday. There's 700,000 people renting. How can we have an accurate electoral register with those figures when we make it difficult for people? I agree, it's completely insane the lengths that people are put to go on the electoral register or to take part in the voting process. I think young people is another huge area. As we saw in the recent referendum, young people will vote when they feel there's something worth voting about. And in fact, young people played a critical role in the passing of the recent referendum, as did working class people who don't normally vote. There was definitely higher voting turnout in those areas, and women as well, primarily. From my own canvassing, that those were the people who were really concerned on the issue. But my point is that yes, I certainly favour lowering of the age, but why do we make it difficult for young people to get in the register? I mean, surely if you go in to do your Leaving Cert, there should be a table there where you can register to vote, because you're generally going to be 18. Like, these initiatives need to be looked at, and they're not coming forward at the moment. Lastly, there's a debate to be had about our exiles, people who've been exiled from this country, mostly for economic reasons, some for social reasons, some by choice. But there's no question a lot of it was forced, and therefore there's a debate to be had about whether the vote should be opened up to them. But I'm actually more concerned about the people who do live and work here having a vote. And I definitely feel, from living in a constituency that's new and diverse, etc., that a lot of people are being excluded. I mean, a lot of these people contact me with housing problems, homeless problems, rent problems. They've no vote. So the TDs really don't care about them. Possibly councillors might, because they might have a local election vote. But there seems to be no concern about our new population actually having a vote. So I do think the register is probably the most thing that we've mostly focused on, but I agree that other reforms need to be looked at in relation to making it easier for people to cast their vote. I wouldn't necessarily be a fan of postal voting. I was just in America, where they have a different electoral system. The primary system, you use a postal vote between a 2-week period in this particular state. And actually it's difficult then to get people to vote. You know, because at least when it's in one day, you can pull out the stops, everyone knows their friends are getting, etc. But I'm open to the idea of it. I do think it is amazing that when people go on holiday, they automatically lose their right to vote, and it was booked well in advance of the election being called, for example, or for work reasons, obviously. And we've all experienced that. So they're just some of my thoughts on the process.
Anybody who can reply to those? Professor Farrell.
Could I just have a go? I mean, they're all very valid points. I don't disagree with anything you've heard you say. But they group into at least two areas. You know, you talk about the rights of immigrants, of migrants, and of young people in particular. And they all group in my area to the whole discussion about the franchise. and whether the franchise should be extended now to groups that are currently not included. And I would have thought a properly developed electoral commission would be commissioning research to explore that very thing, coming forward with policy proposals. And then secondly, you talk about renters. That addresses the question of voter registration, which has come up again so often. Again, I say an electoral commission that's properly constituted would be monitoring, setting down standards, looking for good practice, experimenting, and coming forward with proposals for change. So I'm completely on the same page as you, I think.
Certainly, there's a good bit of work done on reasons for turnout. I think the views are not entirely consistent on postal voting. A lot of the conclusions on postal voting said it makes it easier to vote for those who would vote anyway. Clearly, if you're going on holiday and otherwise you couldn't have voted, that helps you. But for someone who doesn't tune into politics and wouldn't think about voting, they still won't vote, even with a postal vote. There are other consequences of postal voting. In Sweden, where postal voting is very easy, and it's good to see, 2/3, at least, have voted long before the election is actually held. So all that running around campaigning is probably a waste of time, because most of the people you're campaigning at have already voted. I think that's something to think about. But on judges, I sat in this seat, or the one next to it, or the one on my right here once before, and suggested we should have the head of a tabloid newspaper as running the Electoral Commission rather than the judge, because they might be rather better at communicating with the people than the average judge that runs the Electoral Commission. There have been some very notable counter-examples, but I think there have been some good examples. I don't know that I necessarily still subscribe to that view, but why a judge? I don't know. I don't think they're particularly neutral. I've met quite a few of them. But in the world in which we live, and again, comparable countries in the UK, in Australia, in New Zealand, in Canada, the English-speaking world, as people used to say, they do seem to have a high opinion of judges and a pretty low opinion of the rest of us. That's the way it is.
Andrew, the points are really well made. I just have two reflections. One, you're absolutely right, this issue of redundancies and so on, these are very real, and in fact there's huge hidden costs that people don't think about when you're trying to merge organisations and suddenly discover, that there's not enough people, there's too many people, there's different IT systems. It's very practical, but they're real concerns, and straight away you've the media coverage saying, oh, another Quango, another 50 million or whatever it is. So this is a very important point about if you are going to set up an electoral commission, what are these transitional arrangements, where are people's jobs going to go, and so on. And secondly, the issue you raise about the different social groups, I think this is vital as well to the whole discussion about what is the design of the Electoral Commission going to be. Is it going to be a small group of the great and the good, the clerk of the Dáil and the Seanad, and a judge of some sort? I would point to the success of the Road Safety Authority. One of the Road Safety Authority seems to have cracked this quite well. And again, it's not easy to read across, but that's okay. They set up what they call a stakeholder board. It wasn't in their legislation, but they brought in people from various groups and listened to them, and they met quarterly in the early days of the Road Safety Authority's existence, saying, look, what exactly are the issues? The Road Safety Authority board was one concerned with governance primarily. It wasn't a stakeholder board, but they had this advisory stakeholder board, and I think that would address that issue. Thanks.
Just briefly as well on the jobs, I just wanted to follow up that a lot of what we're talking about is consolidating existing positions under the one umbrella, but there are things that we can learn from other countries, and one of the reasons why we recommended following something along the lines of the UK model, where they still use staff from local authorities, is because the experience in Australia and Canada has both been that it's becoming very difficult for them to actually hire staff, because these are staff who would just work for 2 or 3 days at an election time. They're quite long hours, the pay tends to be pretty poor, and I think it was Canada saw a 25% drop in the number of applications that they had between two elections. So one of the cautionary notes that is in the research on electoral management bodies is that if there is an existing structure that works well around the provision of these ad hoc services, that should be maintained, because it can be difficult to establish new ones. So it's not that people would be losing their jobs, it's that people who currently do this would still continue to do this work, but within a more structured framework with clear standards and hopefully better training provision as well.
Maybe just one short on that. There's a problem worldwide, I think, in that when votes are counted manually, traditionally the people employed to do this have been bank tellers, but there are very few bank tellers left So the people with the occupational skills of actually counting pieces of paper are disappearing very rapidly. The other point I'd make is in relation to this question of a quango. I think there's a very good analogy with the establishment of the court service, in that previously the administrative support functions for the courts were scattered amongst local authorities, the Department of Justice, the Department of Finance, and the court service, I think, has generally been recognised to be a great success over the last 15 years or so in terms of bringing all those things together, having effective planning, and indeed also absorbing very substantial budget cuts in the last few years quite successfully. So it hasn't, there's a board. Well, there's a board that has a majority of judges on it, but that's another story. Well, natural enough in that case. But the point I would make, of course, is that we only have the court service because of Harry Whelan, Father Brendan Smith, etc. So it may well be that we have the same scenario in relation to the Electoral Commission, that it'll only be if we have a major scandal in relation to the administration of elections that we'll actually see such a body.
Deputy Mulheron.
Thank you. Thanks to the witnesses. I support the idea that we would have an electoral commission. I served on the Constitutional Convention, and so many issues in relation to the Constitution we looked at brought us back to a point of we need an electoral commission. And I think there in itself there was an exploration of issues, matters that could be brought within